You're a science teacher.
I made mistakes.
You're thinking about moving, but you're gonna wait until the interest rates.
When greater. Time, matter, control. These are no longer theories, they're choices.
By the time the cameras started rolling, the outcome was already decided. The world knew this film would be historic. Records would fall, fans would celebrate, and the story would be remembered as a victory lap for an entire era of cinema. But not every struggle happens on screen. Behind the scale, the spectacle, and the certainty of success, there was a quieter pressure, one that didn't come from box office expectations or visual effects, but from something far more personal. Long-running franchises don't just build characters. They slowly reshape the people who carry them. Years of physical transformation. Years of narrative compromises. Years of being essential to a universe, yet rarely centered within it. By the time Endgame arrived, the role had already taken more than most audiences realized. What made this moment especially difficult wasn't the action or the secrecy, it was finality. Knowing that an arc was closing without the space to fully control how it would be remembered. Knowing that legacy would be decided by a story larger than any single character. For Scarlett Johansson, Avengers Endgame wasn't just an ending, it was a reckoning, with expectations, with sacrifice, and with what had quietly been carried for years while the spotlight looked elsewhere. By the time Avengers Endgame entered production, the character had already lived multiple lives. Introduced quietly, reshaped repeatedly, and stretched across nearly a decade of storytelling, she had become familiar to audiences in ways few roles ever do. Familiarity, however, often hides cost. Long-running franchises ask for consistency more than evolution. They reward endurance over exploration. And over time, that balance can begin to feel less like opportunity and more like containment. The struggle wasn't sudden. It accumulated. Years of physical preparation took their toll. Training cycles that never truly reset. Diets that became routine. Injuries managed quietly so schedules wouldn't slip. The body became part of a machine designed to deliver reliability on demand. Strength was expected. Fatigue was not. But the physical strain was only the surface layer. Narratively, the character existed in a strange space. Essential to the team, but rarely allowed full interiority. Defined by competence more than complexity. Often positioned as emotional support rather than emotional center. That positioning mattered, especially as the universe expanded and newer characters arrived with more room to develop. There is a particular frustration that comes with being foundational but underexplored. As the franchise grew, the stakes increased, not just for the story, but for representation. Conversations around agency, depth, and perspective intensified. Older creative choices were re-examined in a new cultural light. What once felt like progress began to feel limited. By the time Endgame approached, those tensions were impossible to ignore. This film wasn't just another chapter. It was a culmination, a narrative endpoint that would define how years of work were remembered. And that kind of finality creates pressure that doesn't show up in trailers or press tours. The pressure came from knowing that the ending would be definitive, but not necessarily personal. In ensemble films of this scale, individual arcs are negotiated, not owned. Screen time is rationed. Emotional beats are distributed carefully. And personal investment doesn't always translate into narrative focus. That imbalance is difficult to carry when you've given years to a role. For Scarlett Johansson, the challenge wasn't about visibility alone, it was about closure, about whether the character's journey would feel complete or simply concluded. Behind the scenes, discussions about direction, motivation, and consequence carried unusual weight. Decisions made in writers' rooms would define not just a fictional outcome, but a legacy. And once locked, those decisions were immovable. That lack of control is one of the hidden costs of franchise filmmaking. Actors are asked to invest emotionally without being guaranteed authorship. They contribute to shaping a character, but ultimate ownership belongs to the machine. When that machine moves toward an ending, the individual has little leverage. This is where the struggle deepened. The story demanded sacrifice, but sacrifice framed within a structure that wasn't hers to design. The emotional labor required to commit fully, to sell the moment with conviction, existed alongside the awareness that the moment might not reflect the character's full journey. That contradiction is exhausting. Publicly, expectations were massive. Fans speculated relentlessly. Every appearance was analyzed for clues. Silence was enforced through secrecy protocols. There was no space to process the ending openly, even emotionally. Everything had to be contained. Containment became a theme. The role demanded emotional restraint on screen and off. Personal reactions were postponed, reflections delayed. The experience moved forward without the release that usually accompanies closure. At the same time, the industry narrative was shifting. Conversations about equity, agency, and authorship were becoming more prominent. Questions arose about why certain stories were told the way they were, and who benefited from those choices. That context added another layer of pressure. The character had been introduced at a time when expectations were different. By Endgame, those expectations had evolved. Audiences wanted more complexity, more perspective, more interiority. Reconciling those demands within a story already set in motion was nearly impossible. This gap between expectation and execution fueled internal conflict. Not because the role lacked significance, but because its significance was often mediated through others. Heroism was shared. Leadership was diffuse. Emotional consequences were distributed unevenly. And yet, commitment was still required. The performance in Endgame carries a quiet weight because of this. The restraint, the composure, the stillness, they aren't just character choices. They reflect an awareness that this was the last opportunity to honor years of work within a limited frame. That awareness sharpens everything. Scenes are played with precision. Moments are held longer than necessary. Silences carry more meaning. The performance doesn't seek attention, it accepts inevitability. That acceptance is not passive, it's a form of endurance. The struggle, then, wasn't about dissatisfaction. It was about negotiation, between personal investment and collective storytelling, between legacy and limitation, between what the character could have been and what the story would allow her to be. These negotiations rarely make headlines. They happen quietly, in preparation, in performance, and in the space between action and cut. They are absorbed rather than expressed, and by the time the film released, the conversation focused on spectacle, sacrifice, and resolution. The quiet labor that made those moments resonate remained invisible. That invisibility is part of the cost. As filming moved deeper into its final stretch, the weight of the ending began to press in ways that were difficult to articulate. This wasn't the usual fatigue that comes with long shoots or demanding action sequences. It was something quieter and more persistent. The awareness that everything being done now would soon be irreversible. Secrecy intensified that pressure. The production operated under extreme confidentiality. Scripts were fragmented. Scenes were filmed out of sequence. Context was withheld even from those performing it. This wasn't just about preventing leaks, it fundamentally altered how the work was experienced. When you don't know the full shape of the story, you can't prepare emotionally in the usual way. Moments of consequence arrived without warning. Scenes that would later be interpreted as definitive were played with limited information. Emotional beats had to be trusted rather than understood. That requires a different kind of commitment, one built on faith rather than clarity. Faith in the story. Faith in the filmmakers. Faith that the meaning would eventually reveal itself. That faith was tested repeatedly. Ensemble storytelling at this scale prioritizes momentum over introspection. Scenes move quickly. Focus shifts constantly. There is little time to linger on individual perspective. For a character whose arc relied on accumulation rather than transformation, this created tension. How do you convey closure without being given space to process it? The answer, in this case, was restraint. Instead of overt emotion, the performance leaned into stillness. Instead of exposition, it relied on implication. Instead of claiming narrative centrality, it accepted a quieter position, one that trusted the audience to read between the lines. That choice wasn't accidental. It was a response to limitation. When the story doesn't pause for you, you adapt by compressing meaning into smaller moments. A look held a fraction longer, a pause before a line, a reaction that arrives just after the cut. These details carry weight precisely because they aren't announced. But carrying meaning this way is demanding. It requires constant calibration, knowing when to pull back and when to lean in, without disrupting the rhythm of a story that doesn't belong to you alone. It requires discipline to serve the whole while honoring the personal. That discipline often goes unnoticed. Behind the scenes, the physical demands continued unabated. Training schedules remained intense. Action sequences required precision and repetition. Injuries were managed discreetly. Recovery happened in narrow windows between setups. The body, like the character, was expected to be reliable. At the same time, the emotional finality loomed. This wasn't just the end of a film, it was the end of a relationship that had shaped years of professional life. Roles that last this long begin to anchor identity in subtle ways. They influence how you're perceived and how you perceive yourself. Letting go of that anchor is rarely clean. There's a particular loneliness that comes with endings in shared universes. The goodbye isn't intimate, it's public. It belongs to fans, to marketing cycles, to collective memory. Personal reflection happens later, if at all. During production, there was no space for that reflection. Everything was forward-facing. The film demanded focus on outcome rather than process, on delivering moments that would resonate at scale, on maintaining continuity across an enormous narrative web. Individual closure was secondary to structural resolution. That hierarchy is inherent to franchises of this size, but living inside it can be disorienting. As the ending approached, the emotional stakes sharpened. Scenes carried double meanings, what they represented for the story and what they represented personally. Performing those scenes required compartmentalization. Personal reactions had to be postponed to ensure clarity on screen. That postponement is another hidden cost. Actors often rely on processing through performance, using the work itself to metabolize emotion. When that avenue is restricted, the emotion has to be held elsewhere. It accumulates. By the time filming wrapped, there was no cathartic release, no sense of completion. The work ended, but the experience remained suspended. The story would soon belong to the world, but the internal reckoning had not yet begun. Post-production extended the limbo. Months passed before the film could be discussed openly. Interviews were carefully managed, questions were deflected, reactions were delayed. Even pride had to be rationed to avoid spoilers. This prolonged silence stretched the experience beyond its natural endpoint. When the film finally released, the response was overwhelming, but diffuse. The scale of attention made it difficult to locate personal meaning. Celebration happened everywhere at once, leaving little room for private reflection. The character's ending became a talking point almost immediately. Debates sparked. Interpretations clashed. Emotional responses varied wildly. The moment that had been carried quietly for so long was suddenly communal. That transition, from private labor to public ownership, can be jarring. It crystallizes the gap between intention and reception, between what was felt during creation and what is perceived afterward. That gap doesn't invalidate the work, but it can complicate closure. The struggle then wasn't confined to production. It extended into aftermath. It lived in the adjustment to absence, in the recalibration of identity once a long-term role concludes, in the quiet question of what remains when a defining chapter closes without ceremony. This is the part audiences rarely see. They see the final scene. They feel the emotional impact. Then they move on. For the person who carried the role, moving on takes longer. Once the noise settled, the real work began. The kind that happens after the cameras stop and the applause moves elsewhere. Endings of this scale are not absorbed in a single moment. They arrive in stages, often quietly, as routine returns and the absence of a long-held role starts to register. For years, the character had provided structure. Training schedules, wardrobe fittings, press cycles, and narrative continuity all created a rhythm that organized professional life. When that rhythm disappears, the space it leaves behind is not immediately liberating. It's disorienting. There is a difference between finishing a project and finishing a chapter. This chapter had been open for nearly a decade. It had weathered shifts in leadership, tone, and cultural expectation. It had adapted to evolving conversations about agency and representation. And through all of it, the role demanded consistency, emotional, physical, and public. That consistency is exhausting to maintain. In the months following release, reflection arrived unevenly. Public discourse focused on spectacle and sacrifice. Fans debated meaning and legacy. Critics assessed impact. But the internal reckoning lagged behind, complicated by the reality that the ending was now fixed, interpreted millions of times over without room for revision. This is the paradox of franchise finales. They promise closure while denying authorship. Once a story reaches that scale, it belongs to everyone and no one at the same time. The individual who carried the role becomes one voice among many, their personal experience flattened into a shared narrative. Gratifying, yes, but incomplete. The hidden struggle here was not regret. It was compression. Years of effort were condensed into a handful of scenes. Emotional labor accumulated over time was expressed in minutes. Nuance was traded for clarity. And clarity, while powerful, can feel reductive when it doesn't capture the full journey. Distance began to reframe that feeling. As time passed, the performance took on a different shape. Viewers revisited it with fresh eyes. The restraint that once seemed understated began to read as intentional. The quiet leadership, the absence of grandstanding, the choice to anchor the ensemble rather than dominate it, these elements aged well. They suggested maturity rather than omission. That reappraisal mattered. It validated choices made under constraint and affirmed that not all impact announces itself loudly. Some of it accumulates through consistency, reliability, and presence across years rather than scenes. Still, recalibration was necessary. Leaving a role this visible requires redefining boundaries, professional and personal. It requires disentangling identity from expectation, especially when public perception has been shaped by a single character for so long. That process doesn't happen through declarations. It happens through choice. What to take next, what to refuse, what to protect. In that sense, the aftermath became an opportunity, not to rewrite the past, but to rebalance the future. The end of the franchise arc created space for authorship elsewhere, for projects with clearer ownership and different scales of responsibility. That shift wasn't a rejection of the experience, it was an integration of it. Integration acknowledges cost without diminishing value. It recognizes that endurance has limits, and that longevity in one lane often delays exploration in another. For performers who anchor massive franchises, this delay is rarely discussed. The spotlight highlights commitment, but obscures opportunity cost. Those costs surfaced most clearly in retrospect. The years spent maintaining continuity meant fewer chances to take creative risks that didn't fit the brand. The discipline required to serve a universe left less room for deviation. None of this invalidates the work, but it contextualizes it. Context is what transforms struggle into insight. The legacy of Endgame for this role, then, is not defined solely by the ending on screen. It's defined by what the ending unlocked afterward: agency, recalibration, and the freedom to choose without the gravitational pull of a shared mythology. This freedom arrives quietly. There is no victory lap for letting go, no ceremony for shifting identity. It happens in the privacy of decisions that never trend, projects pursued for substance rather than scale, collaborations chosen for alignment rather than exposure. Over time, the struggle that once felt invisible became legible, not as a flaw in the experience, but as a feature of how franchises function. They extract steadiness, they reward reliability, and they rarely pause to account for what that steadiness costs. Understanding this changes how we read the performance. What once seemed minimal reveals itself as measured. What seemed constrained reads as disciplined. The quiet carries intention. The restraint carries meaning. The arc, while not expansive, feels complete in a different register, one built on accumulation rather than climax. That reading doesn't resolve every debate. It doesn't need to. The value of this chapter lies in its complexity. It shows how success can coexist with limitation, how centrality can coexist with underexploration, and how closure can arrive without feeling comprehensive. These contradictions are not failures of storytelling alone. They are byproducts of scale. In the end, the hidden struggles during Endgame tell a larger story about modern franchises, that they ask performers to be pillars, steady, adaptable, and silent, while the narrative rushes around them. They ask for patience without promising authorship. They ask for sacrifice without guaranteeing closure. Recognizing this doesn't diminish the achievement, it deepens it. It allows us to see the performance not just as a moment within a spectacle, but as the culmination of sustained labor under constraint. It reframes endurance as craft. And it acknowledges that some of the most meaningful work in blockbuster cinema happens without fanfare. That recognition is overdue. Because the most demanding roles are not always the loudest ones. They are the roles that ask for consistency across years, restraint across scenes, and commitment across changing creative landscapes. Endgame closed a door. What mattered most was not what was left behind, but what could finally be opened afterward. With time and distance, the hidden struggles surrounding Avengers Endgame become easier to name, not as conflict or dissatisfaction, but as consequence. Consequence of scale. Consequence of longevity. Consequence of carrying a role that was never designed to belong to one person alone. The ending did what it was meant to do for the story. It landed with emotional force. It provided narrative finality. It gave audiences a moment they would remember. But finality for a universe does not always translate into closure for an individual. That distinction is where the quiet difficulty lived. For years, the role had required steadiness above all else. Consistency across directors, tones, and narrative shifts. A willingness to adapt without complaint. To anchor scenes without dominating them. To serve the larger story even when personal exploration was limited. That kind of work rarely draws attention to itself. It doesn't arrive with monologues or grand emotional showcases. It arrives through reliability, showing up prepared, holding the line, and maintaining credibility across time. It's a form of labor that is easy to underestimate because it feels seamless. But seamlessness is not effortless. By the time Endgame closed the arc, the weight of that seamlessness had accumulated. Years of physical discipline. Years of creative negotiation. Years of public perception shaped by a single character. All of it converged into a conclusion that was decisive for the story, but compressed for the person inside it. Compression is exhausting. It reduces complexity into clarity. It distills years into moments. And while clarity serves audiences well, it can leave the individual feeling as though parts of the journey were never fully expressed. This isn't a criticism of the film. It's an observation about the structure of franchises themselves. Franchises are designed to prioritize cohesion over interiority. They move forward relentlessly. They demand alignment. And when they end, they rarely pause long enough to account for what that alignment required. The hidden struggle was not about regret or resentment. It was about recalibration. Learning how to step out of a role that had shaped professional rhythm, physical routine, and public identity for nearly a decade. That step is rarely visible. Audiences move on to the next story. The industry pivots to the next phase. But for the person leaving the role, the transition is internal before it is external. It involves renegotiating boundaries, rediscovering creative instincts that may have been set aside, and choosing what kind of work comes next without the gravitational pull of a global franchise. This is where the ending becomes instructive. It reveals how success can be double-edged, how longevity can narrow as much as it expands, and how roles that appear empowering on screen can quietly limit exploration off it. None of this diminishes the achievement. In fact, it deepens it, because sustaining a character across such a long span, without losing credibility, relevance, or audience trust, is its own form of mastery. It requires restraint when expansion would be easier, discipline when variation is tempting, and humility when visibility is guaranteed. Those qualities are not often celebrated in blockbuster cinema. They should be. The performance in Endgame reads differently with this context in mind. What once appeared understated reveals itself as measured. What felt contained shows discipline. The absence of overt emotional signaling becomes a choice rather than a limitation, a reflection of a character who had always operated in the margins of the narrative, holding things together rather than pulling focus. That reading reframes the entire arc. It suggests that the role was never about being the loudest presence. It was about being the most consistent one. And consistency, over time, is what allows universes to function. The hidden struggle, then, was the cost of that consistency. Cost paid quietly. Without complaint. Without spectacle. As distance from the franchise grows, the value of that work becomes clearer. It stands as an example of what it means to contribute meaningfully within constraints, to accept limits without disengaging, to deliver impact without insisting on ownership. That lesson extends beyond one role. It speaks to how modern blockbuster storytelling functions and what it asks of the people inside it. It asks for endurance more than expression, alignment more than authorship, service more than spotlight. Understanding this changes how we talk about success. Success isn't only about visibility or narrative centrality. It's about sustaining quality under pressure, about remaining grounded in a system that rarely slows down, about leaving something stronger than you found it, even if the credit is shared. That's what Endgame ultimately represents in this context. Not just an ending, but a turning point. A moment where accumulated effort finally gave way to freedom. Freedom to choose differently, to explore without constraint, to define the next chapter on different terms. The hidden struggles didn't weaken the legacy. They gave it depth. They remind us that behind every massive cultural moment are individuals negotiating trade-offs that audiences never see. And that some of the most demanding work in cinema happens not in explosive scenes, but in years of sustained commitment. The story ends not with loss, but with transition. And transition, while quieter than spectacle, is where growth actually begins. If this story changed how you think about blockbuster roles, long-running franchises, and the unseen costs of cinematic success, stay with the channel. Here, we go beyond headlines and box office numbers to explore what major roles really demand and what they quietly take in the worlds of film and celebrity. Subscribe for deep, documentary-style breakdowns of iconic performances, franchise turning points, and the psychological realities behind Hollywood's biggest moments. And if there's another role or actor whose story deserves this level of honest exploration, share it in the comments. Because sometimes, the most important stories in cinema are the ones that unfold after the final scene fades to black.